Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to part 6 of our rather long series titled Journey Through Time, Dialogue with Great Minds from History. On our 6th program, we welcome from the past, in the Chautauqua format, Mr. Galileo, who was born in Italy in 1564. And he became a pioneer of modern physics and telescopic astronomy. He was also a professor of mathematics, and he built the first astronomical telescope in 1609, and he devised the mechanical calculation device known as the sector. And he wrote books. He was really a Renaissance person and a great scientist. Mr. Galileo, come to our time here in 2006, and welcome from the past, and we look forward to the interview.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Galileo, welcome to our time. In our time, we're very curious about a number of things, and so we're curious about your background, your formative years when you were growing up. What was that like?
Well, I was born and I grew up in the area of Florence. My father was a court musician. My father, Vincenzo, to the Medici family, who were the Dukes of Florence. And I was the oldest of 7 children. I had 2 younger brothers and 4 younger sisters. One of them died before she was about 7 or 8 years old. The other 3, I had the responsibility of finding dowries for them because my father died in 1590 when I was about 26, and I became head of the family. And all the financial cares of the family, including one of my brothers who was constantly in debt. I went to a monastery school outside of Florence for several years, and then went to the University of Pisa, also in Tuscany. And I did not have a good reputation at school because I was constantly arguing, disputing. My father had a reputation for not being willing to just accept authority. He as a musician, he thought we should have a music that was more experimental, that actually tried out notes instead of just following the long-time formulas that people had. And I had some of the same attitude. And so that eventually led to me leaving the University of Pisa without a degree, but 4 years later, because of my mathematical abilities, I was appointed as a professor of mathematics at Pisa, and of course that's where I did my first experiment where I had disputed Aristotle's concepts about motion and demonstrated what are now considered in your time the laws of motion, that bodies of different weights will still fall at the same rate of speed.
Thank you.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, Galileo.
Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have a conversation with you. Share with us what some of the controversies were that surrounded you during your time.
Well, actually, I think when you talk about the controversies, there was basically one big controversy, and then I got involved in that controversy from a scientific perspective. The one big controversy, in some ways, was the authority of the Catholic Church. As you might be aware, there had been a Reformation. We sometimes call it the Protestant Revolt within the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church had replied with a counter-Reformation, which in some ways was a more orthodox and stricter response to Catholic belief, and in some ways there were some reforms as well. But one of the places that people began to question the authority of the Church was this whole concept, which had been revolutionary 300 years earlier, that you could use logic to understand science and nature, that you didn't just have to accept things on faith. And the pagan Aristotle had been accepted into the church by Thomas Aquinas, made that possible. That was 300 years before my time. By my time, people like William of Ockham in Oxford and others were beginning to question this idea of science based on logic. Like my father, they began to wonder if we shouldn't test science by evidence of the what you might call the five senses. And things had become very heated, not because of a little experiment I did about Aristotle's laws of motion, although that led to the mounting lack of faith, I guess you would say, in the Aristotelian process. But this monk, Copernicus, in Poland, has turned into a real problem. I mean, his work was not published until after he was dead because he was so worried about what might happen to him. And all he did, I really need to point this out, all he did was say that logically the Earth should not be at the center, the Sun should be. He kept the 10 concentric circles. He didn't have any way of testing that. But there was a growing argument going on about that Copernicus was right. And the church felt that if Copernicus was accepted, then the authority of the church was in danger. That the Bible basically put Earth at the center of creation. And that this would shake the authority of the church. They even burned a scientist, a man by the name of Bruno, at the stake in Rome in 1600 over this issue. And by 1597, I was writing friends of mine saying that I thought I was a Copernican, but I wasn't saying that publicly. And it wasn't until 1610, in January 1610, when I began to notice through my astronomical telescope various items that made me pretty sure that the Earth was moving. And of course that was heightened by my discovery of the 4 moons of Jupiter, that I really began to not defend, but to publish what I had found and to indicate what that seemed to mean about whether or not the Sun was at the center. I might just very quickly say that part of all this controversy had been what I would say accentuated up in a Protestant country to the north, in the Low Countries, where they did not seem to have this worry about the church authority. Science seemed to have more freedom. And Johannes Kepler and his assistant Tycho Brahe had already decided mathematically, they'd been able to figure out that the motion of the planets could only be explained elliptically, not a circular orbit. But even they had not developed the telescope. They had mathematical evidence, but with the telescope, I had actual empirical evidence.
Was it that specific controversy that led to you being imprisoned for life, the sentence? Or was that a series of things?
House arrest, yes.
Okay.
House arrest for life, yes. Well, that was actually a result of my second hearing before the Congregation of the Faith. I'd had a hearing not before the Congregation of the Faith, but before, how do I put this, cardinals delegated by the Congregation of the Faith as early as 1616. But there was some controversy about that as to what I had been told by Cardinal Bellarmine. The cardinal, 16 years later, in 1633, insisted that he had told me that I could not teach, hold, or defend the Copernican principles. And there had been minutes taken, and they produced minutes to that effect, but it was clear that those minutes in 1633 were a forgery. I, however, had a letter, a certificate, if you would say, that had been given to me by the cardinal in 1616, and I had retained the letter. I thought I better. And it said that while the teachings of Copernicus were questionable in relation to Catholic faith, I should be careful and I should not hold or defend. It didn't say anything about teach. It didn't say anything about not publishing materials.
Great. Thank you.
I want to pursue some of your invention that led to your publications and your challenge of the theories of the day. Mm-hmm. The Astronomical Telescope, was that the instrument that convinced you that you had some scientific proof that the Earth was not the center of the universe or center of what we now call the solar system?
Absolutely. The Astronomical Telescope had a concave lens and a convex lens, one on one end, one on the other. And with about a 3-foot long telescope, which I crafted out of lead and bronze, I was able to at one time see objects 9 times larger and 3 times closer, what you might call a 3-power telescope. And then I was able to get to basically an 8-power telescope, and then what you might call a 30-power telescope.
And those telescopes told you really some important things.
Well, they enabled me to see the actual landscape of the moon. And it was not a perfect sphere, as Aristotle said it would be. It had mountains. And now I did a very Aristotelian thing. I basically developed an analogy to make an observation. And the analogy was I saw dark spots on the moon, and I reasoned that if I were to look at Earth from up in the atmosphere, that the dark spots, the sea, would be the seas, because they would not be reflecting the light. And so then I reasoned that the dark spots I saw on the moon must be seas. And I understand in your time you haven't found any water on the moon yet.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I was not totally free of an Aristotelian way of thinking, and I want to say that. But I went on to notice that Venus had different phases, and I would not have been able to observe that if the Earth had been stationary. I would have always seen only one phase of Venus if the Earth had been stationary. And then, of course, there was the discovery of the 4 moons of Jupiter.
Yes, and all that was possible through your
through that
invention.
telescope.
And so then as you did that, it became more and more clear to you that it wasn't the Earth, but it was the sun that was the center.
And I went on to make observations of sunspots, which may have damaged my eyes to some extent, because we knew nothing about sunspots.
Right.
But the motion of the sunspots, the fact that they were in different places, indicated to me that they could only be in different places if the Earth was moving around the sun.
And my other question then is, obviously you shared this with other people who had the same curiosity.
I did, and I even wrote a book.
You wrote a book, but other people could use your instrument and will come to the same conclusion.
Yes.
Why do you think that those who had very curious minds and were open to new theories would do that, but there were others that were so determined that even in the face of the evidence, they defied that evidence, and that got you in trouble?
It did get me in trouble, and part of that was because my evidence basically seemed to be in full rejection of Holy Writ, of the Scriptures. And therefore, that was considered dangerous, and a lot of the people who were using telescopes were not in Catholic countries. A lot of this observation that was happening particularly in places like Amsterdam.
So there was what happens in all times in history in all parts of the world and in different locations, but there was a conflict taking place between what you were developing called scientific evidence versus the belief system or the attitude. And they can collide at times.
Well, they certainly did, and you have to understand that in my time, the great numbers of the population had no understanding of what the argument was at all. This was an argument limited to a very small group of people.
Right.
Scholars in the church, scientists who were in the church, but had found evidence. And I even wrote a letter to my patron, the Grand Duchess Christina, that I really believe that God had given us the gift of reason. Thomas Aquinas had made that argument too, that we were to use our gift of reason to find evidence of God in the earth. You see, according to Thomas Aquinas, there were two theologies. There was a theology, the natural theology, which was based on reason, and with reason we could develop virtue, we could organize governments, we could create ethics, and we could explore nature. But when we died, we would die without grace. We might be the most virtuous people around, but we were still pagans. And so we would not go to heaven. But the idea is that with reason and virtue, we would become aware of God's presence. And through faith, then, we would be in a state of grace. That was the revealed theology. When we died, we'd be in a state of grace, and we would go to heaven. I do not mean to take much of your time, but I think it's very important that I considered myself a very devout Catholic, a good churchman. And I was aware of all of these ideas. I did not want to die and not be in a state of grace. It was of great concern to me. But the result of all this was that I found myself arguing that God had revealed himself in two books, Holy Writ, which was for our salvation, and nature, which was the observant executrix of God's glory and will.
So they both were essential.
They were both essential.
Janelle
and
Burke.
They were not incompatible.
Janelle Burke.
Well, you have very interesting ideas, and you committed those to writing.
Yes.
Tell us how it was to be a writer in those days. What did you have to do in order to get something written down?
Well, if you didn't have the Pope censoring your work, it was easier. And I did have my work being examined after the Starry Messenger. The Assayer did not have as much. That came out in 1619. But after the Assayer, I was being told that anything I wrote about the heavens had to be approved by the Congregation of the Faith. But in answer to your general question, we did have printing presses in those days. We hadn't had them very long, only since the late 1400s. But you would write. Often I would write with a scribe type pen and on parchment, and you would usually personally take your manuscript, even if it meant several hundred miles over very bad roads. You would take your manuscript to be printed, and it would be printed usually at your expense. And then you would attempt to sell folios, the printed work, to libraries, to patrons. You would hope that your patron, in my case the Medici family, would actually authorize 100 copies to be printed, and to give you some, I don't know if you'd call it a royalty in your day, but some amount. And then they would, if things were successful, they would authorize more to be printed. I had the added difficulty that I could not have anything that dealt with Copernicus printed without having to wait sometimes as much as 2 years to have a chapter approved by the Congregation of the Faithful, or the Faith.
Erna Reinhardt.
One of the things that you're most famous for is how you analyzed things as a scientist. And I think it was a different way than what had previously been done. It was called the experimental scientific method. tell us how that was different and what that is, number one, and how that was different from what other scientists were doing at the time.
Well, a science based on logic, the Aristotelian method, you would make a few observations and then draw a logical conclusion. Now, like for example, the use of an analogy. I gave one little example of that with what I saw on the moon. I saw dark places on the moon, and I made the analogy that if you were to look down on the Earth, the oceans would be the dark places. So I made dark places on the moon oceans and seas, which I believe you still have today. The idea of the new science, which was really discussed in the New Organon by Francis Bacon in a Protestant country called England, was to say that you should not reason from the general to the specific. You should start with the fact, and the fact should be verified by measurement and by experiment. And you should not assume that the experiment would always end the same way, which meant frequent experimenting. And then your conclusion, at the most, would have to be a tentative conclusion. We would call that a hypothesis today. And eventually you might call it a natural law, but you had to be very careful to understand that new evidence could change the natural law. And this is called an empirical method, a scientific method. And the key to it is measurement. And that was one of the things that I did that was unusual. If you were a scientist, you were a natural philosopher. You thought about things as if they were a puzzle. And then you tried to deduct from what you had a logical conclusion. I instead wanted to measure and to test, but there was no way to measure. And so I had to invent a variety of devices. I invented a kind of a thermometer, you would call it, because I wanted to be able to measure temperature when I was doing experiments. I developed a device that I think you call a military compass, which was designed to enable people with cannons to know how they could estimate the thickness of a fortress wall and what kind of cannonball they'd have to fire and at what arc. I mean, that was something that I had to invent. I had to find ways to measure distances to the various objects I saw with the telescope. All this scientific method is really about is measurement. Hard mathematical measurement, whether you talk about volume or distance or speed, and explaining things in terms of hard facts tested by experiment.
I'm very fascinated in our time with people in history who had the kind of mind you do, and we have people today that are alive today that we interview, and I'm fascinated with their abilities to be creative, to invent, to write great works, and that is a gift only to a few in the world. And so I guess my question is, out of that fascination, how do you recognize that in students? You were a professor of mathematics, and I have a two-part question. One is, how do you identify students that have that, and how did you train students to be, as yourself, not afraid to seek new theories and ideas?
Well, you should probably understand that most of my contact with students happened in the time that I was at the University of Padua in the Republic of Venice. And I would have students, and students would sometimes want to argue with me on the basis that I was disputing the church. And I had very little patience with that. But the students that showed interest in what I had to say. And I remember at Padua, I did not have an astronomical telescope. So my work at Padua was primarily for the government of the Republic of Venice, working in their tunnels to help strengthen their fortification. I developed pumps so that they could channel water as well as evacuate water. I developed fortifications on walls. I developed, as I say, the military compass for the use of the cannons. I got really bad arthritis from all the dampness that I was in and the tunnels I had to wade through. But what I would do is I would invite students to work with me, and I would also have students, after I had made an initial measuring device, I would have them make devices.
So they were part of your experiment. Unfortunately, the time is running out on us, Mr. Galileo, and now I'm going to go out of character for our guest. And as you know, this Chautauqua, we bring in really scholars who do this, and I want to really introduce to you now the real person, which is, of course, Professor Fred A. Krebs. He's a professor of history at Johnson County Community College, and he holds a baccalaureate and master's degrees in history, one from the University of Kansas and his master's from the University of Missouri at Kansas City. He was a Rhodes Scholar finalist, and he is certainly a distinguished professor. Mr. Krebs, you've been here 3 other times at our institution, and we thank you so much. And we know you do many of these performances a year, and not only Mr. Galileo, you do Ben Franklin and others. So I want to thank you for being with us, and I know that you find this particular format is very helpful for a learning process.
I'm convinced it's the best way to teach history.
Yes, and I find from our symposiums when we do the Chautauqua formats that students not only love it, but they say they retain such a much larger extent of this. And you've been doing this for how many years now?
About 21. I started back in 1985.
Yes, and it certainly shows with your professionalism. And some years you do as many as 60 lectures and seminars and workshops. And thank you again for being with us, and good luck in your continued work.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be up in Coeur d'Alene. I really enjoy the program that you have here with the Popcorn Forum. I think it's one of the most distinguished in the country.
Thank you. That's so kind of you to say so. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week. At the same time, we'll do part 7 of our journey through time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.